Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our final plenary session of the virtual NACCB 2020. My name is Rebecca McCaffrey, and I am co-chair of the Scientific Program Committee, along with today's moderator, John Sanderson. It is my pleasure to be here to introduce today's plenary and to present some awards. I'm joining you today from Bozeman, Montana. I would first like to acknowledge that I'm located on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territories of the Salish Kootenai, the Absaroka, or Crow, and the Cheyenne people. As of many individual speakers, symposium moderators, and other presenters, I would like to take a moment to honor with gratitude the land upon which I reside and the people who have stewarded it through countless generations. I also want to again acknowledge our Director of Operations at SCBNA, Megan Koziol, for all her continued work on making this conference a success. We simply can't thank her enough. And thanks to the whole SCBNA board, committees, and volunteers who have helped shepherd us into this land of virtual conferencing. It's been a wild ride. Now, it's my distinct honor to present this year's SCBNA, to present this year's recipient of the Edward T. LaRoe Award. The LaRoe Award recognizes the application of science to resource management and policy and goes to individuals who translate principles of conservation biology into real-world conservation. It is often given to current or former employees of government agencies or to individuals who have spent at least part of their career in public service. This year's recipient is Dr. Miley Neal. Miley has dedicated her career to studying critical conservation problems and providing practical guidance for policy and management. A committed public servant, she began her career as ranger at Channel Islands National Park, followed by almost 10 years as a botanist on the San Bernardino National Forest. Now as an academic researcher at the University of Maryland, she uses cutting-edge ecological and evolutionary science to understand spatial patterns of plant biodiversity and apply this understanding to help conserve and restore diversity. Beyond publishing in peer-reviewed journals, she translates results for practitioners, often through extensive interactions with conservation personnel in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the USDA Forest Service, the Department of Defense, and state natural resource agencies. In summary, Miley's innovative research and cross-disciplinary approaches to developing practical solutions for conserving species highlights her leadership in translating conservation science into real-world conservation and makes her an ideal recipient of the Edward T. LaRoe Memorial Award. Congratulations, Miley. Miley has pre-recorded some remarks for her acceptance of this award, which we will play now.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're having a great virtual meeting. So it's hard for me to convey the great honor it is to receive the LaRoe Award while talking to myself in front of a computer screen. Perhaps, though, it is easier than standing up in front of a room of intimidatingly accomplished and committed colleagues. So just maybe sitting in my habitat in my backyard is a better choice. Getting the news of this award was certainly a bright spot in the midst of the sudden onset of online teaching, teleworking, and living remotely, even in the suburbs, that took over this spring. Of course, this award is not just a highlight of my spring, it's a highlight of my career. My professional path has been distinctly nonlinear, but the twists and turns from federal agencies to academia via Switzer and Smith Fellowships have focused my research on two central themes: testing scientific assumptions of conservation practice and providing scientifically grounded input to folks who make decisions about our world. Neither are particularly glamorous to my academic colleagues, but for me, they're the nuts and bolts of conservation and they ground my efforts. Having this approach honored by the premier society for our profession is more meaningful to me than I can convey. Even more than feeling honored, though, I am really humbled. Receiving the LaRoe Award makes me reflect on how much more I could and should do and how much I've left undone. This reflection is driven in part by the recognition that conservation is threatened on all fronts, and we have lost ground we thought was secure. This makes all our work all that much more critical. This virtual Congress makes me think back to past SCB meetings. In particular, I remember my grad student nervousness arriving at my first one in 1999 when it was held at the University of Maryland College Park. At that meeting, I never would have predicted that I would later join the University of Maryland faculty, where I have since had the pleasure of training and working with wonderful students and postdocs who've contributed so much to the work that generated this award. I certainly did not envision receiving an award from SCB, and I could not have foreseen the pandemic that would require accepting said award via video from my home that is a stone's throw from that first meeting location. Such surprises and where paths lead give me great curiosity and guarded hope for where we will be 20 years from now as we churn through the chaos and uncertainty of the present. I look forward to seeing you there, and thank you very much.
All right, congratulations again, Miley. Next, I would like to take a few moments to announce today's, this year's Student Presentation Awards. And I'm going to just share my screen now. Okay, this year we had 26 excellent candidates competing for full-length talks, speed talks, and posters. For each category, we awarded a best presentation as well as a best presentation with conservation applications. So first, for the full-length talks, our best presentation award went to Alexandra DeCandia, and our best presentation with conservation application went to Stacy Nurkowski. For the speed talks, our best presentation went to Lauren Kim, and our best presentation with conservation application to Alex Nicole Harper. And finally, in the poster category, our best presentation goes to Claire Teitelbaum, and our best presentation with conservation application to Ashwin Sivakumar. Congratulations to all of our awardees and to all the applicants. And finally, I'm thrilled to introduce the moderator for this plenary, Dr. John Sanderson. John is a denizen of Fort Collins, Colorado, where he's the fairly newly minted director of the Center for Collaborative Conservation at Colorado State University, which he'll be telling you a little bit more about. His current position follows his tenure working as Director of Science at the Colorado Nature Conservancy, and over 25 years of work in conservation in the West. It has been a joy getting to know John and working with him on these plenaries and other aspects of the program. John, take it away.
Okay, good morning, everyone. And after doing this for months, still sometimes challenged to navigate this virtual world here. Thank you all for being here. I'm thrilled to be here helping out with this plenary. We've got a great set of panelists, and I think we're going to have great conversation for the next hour plus a little bit. There's about 125 of you paying attention to this right now, and just want to say thank you so much for joining us. It's more turnout than I would have expected on the last full day of the conference, and I know you've all participated in a lot of other online things, and that it can be quite challenging to hang in there in our offices and homes. And I just want to say I really appreciate you being here. So I'm John Sanderson, as Rebecca mentioned. Last September, I was invited to become the director of the Center for Collaborative Conservation at Colorado State University in the Warner College of Natural Resources. I'm loving my job, and I'm excited about this plenary because this work of collaborative conservation really demands that I bring my whole self to my work. So I bring my intellectual curiosity, I bring my passion for nature, and I also bring my desire to see us come together as communities and people in reciprocal relationship that can really allow us to get the hard work done that we're all dedicated to. Really want to encourage questions. Rebecca's helping us with questions. So as I go on, and then as our three panelists give their presentations, and even as we go into dialogue, please type your questions into the Q&A in the live stream, and we'll be paying attention to those and try to get to as many of them as we can. So, one of our panelists was not able to be here today. Chief Roland Wilson is from the West Moberly First Nations in the province that we call British Columbia. He unexpectedly lost 2 community members recently, and we wish Chief Wilson and his community comfort in these challenging times. And I invited Chief Wilson because I was really hoping to have an Indigenous voice speak to collaboration. But the least I can do, even if he's not here, is acknowledge that where I'm sitting in Fort Collins right now is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and peoples. I also note that I'm working in my office on the Colorado State University campus for the first time since March. And I know that not everyone can do this. I'm here so that I can have a good internet connection, and I know that's not available to everyone. And I know that this is disproportionately true for people of color. And I also, internet access is just one of the many factors disproportionately affecting communities of color during this pandemic. So it's a valuable thing to keep in mind. If you didn't see the first plenary from Monday night, go back and watch it. It was super powerful. So we all know this, right? That we're in this business because species are going extinct. That trend has not diminished. This report from the UN came out a year ago. I don't think things have improved dramatically in the past year. Yet from our speakers, we're going to hear some stories of work that is pushing against this trend. And I'm really excited about that. And I included Polarized Age of Extinction. I included Polarized in the title because of this. You know, if you pay attention to the news, which most of us do, of course, it's hard to avoid right now. You hear stories about how divided we are across the country, Republicans versus Democrats, rural versus urban, US versus Mexico. But again, you're going to hear stories from our speakers that are bringing people together and bringing communities together for conservation and for human well-being. So I'm excited to hear those stories. So I run the Center for Collaborative Conservation. If you look at our materials, for example, our 10-year report that we published last year, you'll see phrases like collaboration unites rather than divides our communities. You'll see us claim that collaborative conservation creates solutions that are far-reaching and long-lasting. And I think that's true sometimes and in some situations. And I think in other situations, it might not be true. And one thing I'm going to be talking about with our panelists is the conditions that make their collaborations work and the places where they still struggle. This collaboration on the Dolores River in Southwest Colorado was something that I was a part of during my tenure at the Nature Conservancy. This was a big event that happened a few years ago where we did emulated a flood flow out of a dam, and it was a big success. And I also just a short while ago looked at the gauge on this river, and I saw that the typical peak flow on this river is about 1,100 cubic feet per second. And this year, the peak flow was 50 cubic feet per second. So that important part of river function was completely missing this year, notwithstanding this big collaborative success a few years ago. So all of our speakers share something in common that is also shared by the Dolores River, which is they all touch the Colorado River Basin. This was a little bit of an accident of my network and Chief Wilson dropping out, but here we are. Nathan Seward is up here in Colorado in the Gunnison River Basin, and he'll tell us some stories about Gunnison sage grouse. And then we'll move over to Osvel Hinojosa, who actually works all the way up and down the western coast of the Americas, but he has spent a good chunk of his career in the Colorado River Delta, doing habitat restoration focused on birds. And then lastly, we're going to hear from Edalin Koziol. And I had to practice that pronunciation and still didn't get it right, I'm sure. But Edalin is a policy associate for the Nature Conservancy's Colorado River program, working on endangered fish such as this razorback sucker that you see in this picture. And the Colorado River is really representative of the kinds of challenges we face in conservation. On the left, the blue line is the flow of the flow of the Colorado River, the water that's draining out of our mountains and our snowpack into the river. The red line is the demand. And about almost 2 decades ago now, these two lines crossed. And you can see projected water demand continues to exceed water supply. And this is going to get worse with our changing climate. The picture on the right is from the Yampa River in northwest Colorado in 2018. And that river is typically flowing, a few hundred cubic feet per second in the late summer. And the staff gauge in this picture a couple of years ago was showing, I think, about 30 cubic feet per second. I actually think it wasn't really flowing. It was just a series of barely connected pools in a sea of sand. So this river really represents the challenges we face, and our panelists represent solutions to those challenges. And just for a little bit of context, you've all heard this, and a lot of us still believe that this is true in the West, but it's changing. And the panelists we have here today represent that change, I think. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Nathan Seward and have him tell us about his work restoring wet meadows for Gunnison sage grouse in the upper Gunnison Basin. So let me now get back here.
Can you hear me okay, John?
You're on, Nathan. You're good to go.
All right. Well, thank you very much, John, for granting me this opportunity to showcase some of our work here in the upper Gunnison Basin watershed. This has truly been some of the most interesting, rewarding, and satisfying work that I've been able to be a part of here in Gunnison. I'm going to give you kind of a brief history and hopefully really showcase and represent our collaborative work here in Gunnison for my partners. The idea is to essentially restore wet meadows and build the idea of resiliency back into the landscape. Now, if you'll go ahead and advance the next slide. For those of you that are not familiar with the Gunnison Basin, we're located in south central Colorado. We are a high elevation intermountain basin, roughly composed of 2.5 million acres. 85% of that is public lands, mostly Forest Service and BLM. 2% owned by the state of Colorado. Our elevations start around 7,000 feet and go just over 14,000. And as John mentioned, we are part of the headwaters of the Colorado River. Okay, next. Next, please, John. So again, giving you a little history, it actually started back in 2009. The Nature Conservancy came down to the Gunnison Basin, was able to, I'll say, gather up all of us land managers, wildlife biologists, resource managers, to have that difficult conversation of what impacts climate change could have on our landscape here in the Gunnison Basin. They brought in a series of different scientists from really across the nation to show us some of these projections of what climate change was going to be doing and some of the different scenarios. By allowing us to have that conversation, a product of that was the development of the Gunnison Climate Working Group. And that has morphed into more of this larger collaborative, multi-purpose, landscape scale ecosystem restoration project that I need to add is now award-winning as well. And you can see we do have a significant number of partners involved for our collaboration. And this is just some of the main players, and it seems like every year we continue to grow and add another partner. Next slide, please. So what really linked us together was the Gunnison sage grouse. Gunnison sage grouse is the newest recognized avian species. It was recognized in the year 2000 as a distinct species. And the Gunnison Basin is home to around 87 to 88% of the worldwide population. And current estimates range from about 2,500 to 2,700 birds left in the world. Okay. So the problem that we're seeing is that past anthropogenic activities have degraded our landscape. What we have is a large number, many miles of incised channels. Some of these are ephemeral, some intermittent, and others are perennial. But what's happening is that some of these past activities, overgrazing by cattle, advent of four-wheel drive vehicles, and even old wagon trails have captured the water and concentrated it, and that's allowing that water to continue to downcut and form these small gullies. And ultimately what that does is it lowers the water table in these areas and literally drains some of the wet meadows that make up a very small percentage of the overall landscape, but are critical for wildlife in this area. Okay. Additionally, we're really in a mega drought here. The beginning of the 21st century, you can see the number of dry months is significantly more than the number of wet months. Next slide, please. Luckily for us, though, Gunnison sage grouse are fighters. Next slide. But we need to help them out. Again, as I mentioned, we have past activities on the landscape that have degraded the habitat. So our goals for the Climate Working Group were to enhance the habitat for Gunnison sage grouse, specifically that late brood rearing habitat and summer fall habitat, which it's those wet meadows or sponges in the landscape. But we realized that we couldn't do this in a vacuum. We needed to help support our land-based livelihoods, such as ranchers in the area. And then we decided that we also wanted to build this idea of resiliency back into the landscape. Next slide. So again, our overall project goal is to build resiliency by restoring the hydrological and ecological functions of the wet meadows to help the Gunnison sage grouse and other wildlife, but also to help ranchers maintain their livelihoods in the face of a changing climate. Next slide, please. So how can we do this? We recruited Bill Zedike here. Bill Zedike is the author of a book called Let the Water Do the Work, Induced Meandering and Involving Methods for Restoring Incised Channels. And what we're doing is simply using simple, low-tech stick and stone structures to actually restore the hydrology in these areas. Next slide. And we're also adopting some newer techniques, such as this BDA on the left. Again, sticks and stones, simple, effective structures for slowing that water down, allowing that water to penetrate into the adjacent stream banks, into these incised channels, and really convert some of the vegetation back to the more wetland or moisture-loving plant species versus these areas where sagebrush has started to encroach because of the lower water table. Next. So are we having success? Luckily for us, we are able to conduct vegetation monitoring with the help of Renee Rondeau with the Colorado Natural Heritage Program. She's been out there with some of our other partners conducting vegetation transects, and you can see here we are having a significant response in our treated sites compared to our controls. And that is even with all these months of less precipitation, as you can see on the right. Next slide. But of course, pictures really speak louder than words. You can see in the upper left photo, 2012, this is the fall. 2012, we were constructing a couple media lunas and one rock dams in the incised channel upstream of this meadow. And you can see the progression of the wetland plant species as we were able to really hold and saturate that wet meadow more from toe to toe of the slopes there. We started with the roughly 25% wetland vegetation cover, and we were able to accomplish up to 95%. And then a project I'm working on is actually looking at the wildlife use through the use of camera traps in our treated areas and control sites. And I just love these two photos here because it shows, you can see 3 adult hens with their broods, foraging on that succulent vegetation and chasing the insects that we're helping flourish in these treated areas. On the right, you can see that these areas are also being heavily used by elk for calving areas. And again, we're just making these areas more productive overall. So on that note, I'd like to pass it over to my co-panelist, Koziol. I know he's going to be sharing his success story in the lower Colorado River Delta.
Thank you. Thank you, John, very much for the invitation. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure being here with all of you today. Next one, please. So I'm from Mexico, and I have spent most of my life working in northwestern Mexico in the region of the Gulf of California. And as John was mentioning, especially in the Colorado River Delta. Next one. And as we heard, no, it's probably one of the biggest conservation challenges in the last over the last century. No, this is the Colorado River at the US-Mexico border. This is what happens when you have an over-allocated river. It dries up before it reaches the sea. Next one, please. And over the last 20 years, a group of people, we have been wondering, well, can we restore this ecosystem, and can we reshape our relationship with the river and with nature over this region? Next one. And of course, it all started to shape up when we began through a collaborative process, a binational collaborative process, not only of NGOs, but also working together with academia, but also federal agencies and local governments and communities and producers and decision makers, to try to define, well, what restoration means, and try to reach a consensus, but also try to understand each other. So this big partnership came together across the border, and this is one of the reasons why things have moved forward. Next one, please. And the very first steps were included getting together with the communities, and especially with the Kukapa tribe, the original inhabitants of the Colorado River Delta region. They have a very close relationship with the river, and their culture is perfectly in tune with the different cycles in the Colorado River Delta region. But also getting together with other stakeholders, with farmers and ejidatarios, landowners in the area, to understand their needs. Next one. And of course, as biologists, we care a lot about wildlife and about birds, and we want to just study the birds, but it was very clear early in the process that if we really wanted to move forward, we really needed to understand water, water infrastructure, water law, water markets, water policy. Next one. And it's very interesting. It really got me and a lot of my partners working a lot with people in meetings, and we prefer to be out in the field, but this was very rewarding. We created great relationships and partnerships, and the great thing is that it resulted in wonderful binational agreements between the US and Mexico for the restoration of the Colorado River, for actually dedicating water for restoration of the Delta in Mexico. Next one. Just to show you some of the results, this is how the riverbed in Mexico near the border looks like in the town of San Luis Rio Colorado. This is the riverbed, and most of the time is completely dry. Next one. And thanks to the restoration effort, this is what happened. The river came back to life. Next. And this was wonderful for the local communities, and especially for the new generations. They have never seen the river with water. So being able to enjoy this, it started to reshape their perception of what the river should look like. And it started changing the relationship of the community with the river and with water. Next one. And of course, habitat restoration has been going on. We have thousands more acres of wetlands now in the Delta because of these restoration efforts. Next one. And wildlife is responding. This is the Yuma Ridgeway rail, the one that used to be called Yuma Clapper rail. It's an endangered species endemic to the lower Colorado in the Delta. And it has been recovering in some portions of the Delta, in the Hardy River. The increase in the population has been over 300% in the last 20 years. Next one. So the question is, how can we take this to scale, to a larger scale? And of course, we know that about 2.9 billion birds have disappeared in North America in the last 50 years. And shorebirds in particular, the populations have decreased 37%. And shorebirds need all of these important coastal sites all along the continent, from Alaska all the way down to Chile. And we need to protect all of these sites, to protect their full life cycle. Next one. And in their migrations there, they face a number of threats, from industry, urban development, tourism, aquaculture, recreation, pollution. And we need to figure out ways to work effectively with all of these sectors, and to address effectively these threats. Next one. And that's the main reason why in 2018, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology launched the Coastal Solutions Fellows Program. And I forgot to mention that I'm the director of the Coastal Solutions Fellows Program and at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And our main goal is to protect threatened and coastal habitats for shorebirds and communities through the promotion of intersectoral and multidisciplinary collaborations and through capacity building for early career leaders in Latin America. Next one, please. And so our fellowship supports 6 fellows every year. We provide funding and training so that they can implement their projects on their countries with a team of mentors, collaborators, and partners. And the fellowship is not only for biologists, ornithologists, or conservation scientists, but it's also for landscape architects, for civil engineers, for sociologists. So we want to promote this cross-sectoral collaboration. So our goal is in the next 5 years have over 150 leaders and experts from different sectors and disciplines working together for coastal resiliency and conservation. Next one. Next, please. Yeah. And so the goal is to be able to balance the needs of communities along Latin America and shorebird conservation by creating a network of disciplines and sectors for coastal resiliency. So we want biologists and landscape architects, civil engineers, social scientists working together with farmers, aquaculture producers, planners, decision makers, and stakeholders all along the Pacific Flyway. Next one. And yeah, so we want to be able to balance sustainable development with shorebird conservation. Next. And if you want to learn more, you can visit our website at Soluciones Costeras. And thank you very much. And with that, I will turn the presentation over to Edalin. Thank you.
Thanks, Osel. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. All right. Good morning. My name is Edalin Koziol, and as John mentioned, I'm a policy advisor with the Nature Conservancy's Colorado River program. I've been asked to talk with you all about 2 related collaborative species conservation efforts that the Conservancy has been engaging in the upper Colorado River Basin states now for about 30 years. The Nature Conservancy was founded in 1951 by a small group of scientists interested in using sound science to support taking direct action to save threatened landscapes. And from those beginnings, TNC has grown and evolved, and we now have over 1 million members and impact conservation in 79 countries and territories across 6 continents. While TNC's roots are in land protection, our mission today is to conserve the lands and waters upon which all life depends. And in all of its work, the Conservancy strives for conservation approaches that benefit both people and nature. And in the Colorado River Basin, this means working to sustain healthy river ecosystems and the people that depend on them. Slide, please. So most people know the Colorado River for its iconic landscapes. John had some great pictures already, but it's also an incredibly hardworking river, and I think we've heard a little bit about that from all of the folks that have preceded me today. But just to give a little bit more context, from its headwaters in the Rocky Mountains, the Colorado River flows through 7 states in the US and 2 in Mexico. It provides drinking water for more than 40 million people. It irrigates roughly 5.5 million acres of agricultural land. If you eat vegetables in the winter, it's more than likely they're grown with Colorado River water. In addition, the river and its tribs provide hydropower for the western United States and also support a $26 billion recreation economy. So altogether, the river and its tribs drive about $1.4 trillion in economic activity annually and 16 million jobs, about 1/12 of the nation's economy. So you can tell that the river and its tributaries are critically important for people, but they're also essential for wildlife. The basin is home to a range of ecosystems and supports thousands of native species, many of which are endemic to the basin. For example, 20 of the native fish species that are found in the river basin are found nowhere else in the world. And this is all in an area that on average sees about 6.5 inches of precipitation per year. Slide, please. So over 90% of that surface water in the Colorado River Basin is from snowmelt. To manage this supply for all of the uses I mentioned before, upstream flows in the basin are captured, stored, and distributed through what's really an expansive system of dams and diversions. The Colorado system is so managed that it's often described as a plumbing system, which is why I love this image, rather than a river system. So each reservoir is a bucket, and the rivers are just ditches or pipes that move the water from the buckets to the places where the water is used. Today, though, the Colorado River and its tributaries are especially threatened by climate change, like Koziol mentioned, and acidification, by water uses and dam operations that alter river function, although it's a little bit better than it was before, and also by invasive species. So, for example, of those 20 native fish species that I mentioned earlier, today 16 of those are federally endangered or threatened. And as also has mentioned and shown us pictures, the river no longer reaches its delta. So all in all, the Colorado River Basin system is highly variable, and supply has been decreasing and will continue to do so. So this situation really creates risk and uncertainty for all of the water users, including the environment. Slide, please. So now that I've kind of set the stage, I want to take you back to the early 80s. And in the early 80s, we were facing a situation where we were really starting to feel the unintended consequences of all of that water development in the upper basin. 4 of our warm water native Colorado River fish species had been or were lined up to be listed as endangered. From the top to bottom in this image, we had the Colorado pike minnow, the bony tail, a humpback chub, and the razorback sucker. So in order to protect these 4 fish species, Colorado, New Mexico, Wyoming, and Utah were going to have to replace all new water depletions with a federal nexus. This was, the early days of implementation of NEPA and the Endangered Species Act. So that was what they were facing. And suffice it to say, this would have effectively stopped further water development in the basin and would have resulted in some very serious economic and day-to-day impacts. We faced a situation that looked like it could result in a confrontation similar to that we had seen in TVA versus Hill when we were starting to implement the Endangered Species Act. But rather than head to court, a number of the parties involved decided to collaborate and work together to negotiate an administrative solution. The Conservancy was concerned about how continued depletions in the upper basin rivers would impact the 4 endangered species, and so we agreed to participate in this process. And during the negotiations, the water users proposed species recovery to resolve the conflict, and the other parties agreed. And this is different than a lot of other Endangered Species Act responses. It's not mitigation, it's actual species recovery, so that's a pretty big deal. So the Upper Colorado Endangered Species Recovery Implementation was established in January 1988 with the goal of recovering the 4 fish species by 2023, and then a program in the San Juan River watershed followed shortly thereafter. And today, across these 2 programs, the partners have grown to include water users, 4 tribal nations, hydropower interests, conservation groups, of which TNC is one, state agencies, and a number of federal agencies as well. Slide, please. So these recovery programs, we've now been going for about 30 or 40 years. We've already seen some really great successes in 2 important respects. First, the programs shifted ESA compliance from individual water users to the recovery programs, which allowed water development to continue. And in the Upper Colorado River Basin, the two recovery programs have now provided endangered species compliance for the impacts from over 2,500 existing projects, equaling about 3.7 million acre feet of depletions per year. And they also provide compliance for future projects as well. And I know we've talked a little bit about cubic feet per second, but acre feet, just to give you some sense of how big that is, 3.7 million acre feet. An acre foot is the amount of water that it takes to fill a football-sized field, essentially, to about a foot deep. So that's a lot of water. And being able to provide this ESA compliance for all of these projects is huge. It allows major population areas like Denver, Colorado Springs, Salt Lake City to continue to provide drinking water. It allows irrigation projects across the Upper Basin to continue to grow food and fiber that we all use and rely on. So the second success is that while all of this water development is continued, we've already brought 2 of these species back from the brink of extinction, and they're now being considered for downlisting. Slide, please. So collaboration has really been the key to these successes. The recovery program partners all have very different interests for engaging in the programs, but all of these interests require meeting the common goal of recovering the 4 fish species. And through this common goal, we were encouraged to engage in joint research and monitoring efforts that have allowed us to really develop a shared understanding of the needs of the fish and the challenges they face along the path to recovery. Furthermore, meeting this common goal requires us to work together to solve a set of really hairy problems that none of us could solve on our own. And so as a result, we've been able to find solutions that have minimized impacts to water users while still providing water for the fish. In addition, we have had the active involvement of all of our partners. Participants actively engage in the program's governing and technical committees. They use information developed through our biology committees, and management actions are developed and implemented with equal participation from each partner. So due to this collaboration, the recovery programs have enjoyed really strong bipartisan support from all of the presidential administrations since the program started, Upper Basin state congressional delegations, and Congress. And also due to this collaboration, no reclamation contractor or water user has ever suffered an involuntary loss of water. And there has been very, very little litigation compared to other endangered species efforts. Slide, please. So as I said before, the recovery program's goal is to actually recover the fish by 2023, and 2023 is coming right up. So we have seen major progress, like I mentioned, in the years since programs first launched, but we also recognize that we're not there yet. But bringing species back from the brink of extinction does take time. It doesn't happen overnight. So we continue to work to build partnerships both within our group and with other water users. And we continue to take the time to develop good science so that we can make smart decisions together. And that all takes a long time. But because we're not there yet, we're already talking about what these programs look like after 2023 when the collaborative agreements end. So there will likely be differences, but we've learned that the way that we work, which is working together collaboratively, works well. So we are trying to develop the future of the programs together, so stay tuned. And John, that's all I had. So thanks again for this opportunity, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Super. Thank you all for both being here today and for your good work. Osvel, if you could come off mute and turn your video on, join us. Super. Thank you all so much. That's great work and a lot of beautiful pictures too. And actually, I'm going to stop my share here so folks will just see us. Again, I welcome questions. And I'm going to start with a few of my own as our attendees think about what they want to ask. A few questions have already come in. We'll get to those. There's a lot of interest in the water, which is a theme across all of these projects. But I'd like to start in a place where we touched on Tuesday in the human carnivore coexistence plenary, which is social science, or the social dimensions of this work. So Edalin, you had 6 bullets in the elements of your collaborative and what makes it work. And those bullets are, I think the second one, I don't have the slides right in front of me here, but I think the second bullet was agreed on recovery, but all the other ones are about people and group dynamics and getting everyone involved. Now I know Nate prefers to spend his time, or maybe not prefers, I don't know, but I was envious of him last week because he was out checking camera traps to see how the lynx were doing. And Osvel is a bird biologist, among other things. And Edalin, you're an attorney, right? And so none of those really involve explicit training in these really complex social dynamics. I will say, Osvel, you looked quite good in that tie at that signing ceremony. But if you would, I'll speak to these social dimensions and, you know, what have you had to learn? And what also, it strikes me that maybe something might be missing. I'm not sure. Do you think there should be more work on the social dimensions of this, or do we have enough people who know the social dimensions? And what has been your experience of this people side of these collaborations? Any one of you can speak up. You can raise your hand if you want, but we're all on right now, so you can just speak up.
I guess I'll start off, John, that you know, I think sometimes in these collaborations, it's sometimes easy to almost have too many partners. I'll say almost too many cooks in the kitchen, if you will. I think here in the Gunnison Basin, we've found kind of a magical number of different partners, and we've all found our own niche on how we can keep that collaborative effort going and make it successful. You know, the human dimension side of things, I kind of live by the mantra that people want to know that you care before they care about what you know. And I've been lucky enough to work with the ranchers here on some conservation agreements on their properties that help provide them assurances that additional land use regulations would not be imposed on those enrolled lands with the listing of the Gunnison sage grouse. I'm not sure if I mentioned it, but the Gunnison sage grouse is a threatened species. And so through a program called the Candidate Conservation Agreement with Assurances, or CCAA, I've been able to work with these private landowners and again, work closely enough that I'll use the T word, trust. I think over time we've developed that. Again, we have the interest of maintaining what's best for the bird. And again, we've got the time invested. They know they can give me a call. We can bounce ideas off each other. And they know that I care about their livelihoods as well as this threatened species. So I think that's helped develop the trust and made this project more successful.
We've really found that in our work on the recovery programs too. Just, you know, like Nate said, early on, we realized that we needed to take into account the economic realities that our partners were facing in order to really develop practical and durable solutions for the fish. And so, you know, going back to that slide, yeah, all of our participants, and it's a very diverse, large group. All of the participants had an interest in seeing the recovery program succeed, but those interests really ranged the gamut from ESA compliance, continued operation of their water or hydropower projects, adherence to state law, sovereignty, compact compliance, power generation. So, being able to recognize where everybody came from and respecting that, while also recognizing that no one could get their interest met unless we were able to meet our common goal of recovering the species. But John, you also asked a little bit about the training side and the social science side, and that's definitely something that TNC, with regards to our work in the Upper Colorado River Basin, has really taken to heart. We recognize that a lot of us, our training isn't in those social science areas, and so for those of us that have had the experience through prior work of engaging in some of these collaborative efforts, we're able to bring that experience to our work today. But otherwise, we do depend a lot on social science reports, studies. We actually do a lot. We work with a lot of consultants to develop work like that to inform our conservation approaches.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think those elements are all very important. The training, the understanding. On the one hand, the social science, to help guide decisions and action. We are very used to use natural science and engineering to guide decision making and conservation, but not so much social science. And actually, I was very happy to see in many of the sessions, especially yesterday, that a lot of social scientists informing decision making. But then also the social practical part, conversation and communication and engagement. And as biologists, you're right, Edalin, we're not trained on those topics, so it's important to develop those capacities. And then time is probably the most valuable or limited resource we all have, especially thinking about projects. But it's really important to understand that we really need to devote time for building trust in those relationships and to understand the needs, the realities, the economic, social, political, cultural differences of the stakeholders we're engaging. And it takes time, Typically, we don't budget time for the partnerships. And that's something that I learned in my own projects and implementation. Probably you need to dedicate at least 30% of the time just for maintaining the partnership and the communication. I also understand that those agreements or common understanding or consensus is not a one-time thing. It's a thing that you need to keep going because things change. Also, you need to make sure that your group, your partnership keeps engaging, keeps with the common understanding, and so that be prepared for the long-term commitment if you want to have meaningful impact in conservation.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, Edalin mentioned 1988 with the listing of those species, so that suggests a little bit of patience. But so let me pivot over to a technical side here. I'm very curious, and a lot of the people here at this conference are ecologists and biologists, and not so many hydrologists. There might be a few, I suppose, but there's. I'm curious about how the science shows up in your program, and there's been a bit of interest in the Q&A about the water in particular, and so I know all three of you have to deal with water, but tell me about a little bit about the role of water in the recovery of the species, or the response of the rail or of the fish. Or the bird. So what is the role of the water in that? But then how do you navigate that? How do you work with the water users, and how did you make that pulse flow happen in 2014? Can you all speak to a little bit about how that water dimension shows up and how that connects to the recovery of the species that you're working on?
You want me? I can go first?
Sure.
Water is essential. No, it's the key thing, especially in a place like the Colorado River Delta, but in many other systems too. So yeah, I mean, when we started this process over 20 years ago, mid 90s, late 90s, it was, like, ornithologists and experts in vegetation, experts in wetlands, but we really started to get things moving forward when we got in the team water lawyers, and we got hydrologists, civil engineers with expertise in hydrology, but then not only surface hydrology, but groundwater hydrology. And then at that time, we finally, understood the system, and we were in a position to propose, real solutions to the system and to the challenges. So, like, for me, that's a key element. You need to build a team that understand all of those aspects. I mean, I guess I probably had to learn a lot about water law and about hydrology to be able to effectively communicate with my partners. But you need to bring them in. You need the experts with you, and then also economy. Economies were really important in this terms of water markets. And once you have the team, and then also that relationship with the stakeholders. In our case, in the Colorado River Delta, it meant working with the farmers, with the irrigation district, and understanding how an irrigation district works, in this particular one. What are the rules, the official rules and then unofficial rules, and how we interact, the social dynamics, the power dynamics, the market dynamics, and have a partnership, and help them understand also what was our goal. It was very interesting because we were very afraid of having a relationship. Farmers at the beginning, we thought that they were going to just push back, like, no, forget about it. Forget about the restoration of the Delta or allocating water, because they thought that the NGOs would wanted to go and take the water away from them, like through a government policy or something like that. And really, we wanted to create a water trust and just purchase irrigation rights that were on the market already. So when we explained that, like, no, it is voluntary. Whoever is willing to sell the water right, and if they want to sell it and keep it here for restoration versus it going to the city, that's what we want to do. And they loved it. They saw that the benefit, and they saw that we wanted to work with them, and so they became supporters. It's an aspect of understanding and talking and dedicating the time for that.
Koziol, in a minute or two, can you say specifically how is it that you got water, you got the Colorado to reach the sea? Where did that water come from?
Yeah, so it's through the partnership. It's called Raise the River, actually, the partnership of NGOs that work together with academia in the agency. So it was took years to get there in terms of negotiations, but basically it was a commitment between the NGOs, the government of Mexico, and the government of the US, each one providing 1/3 of the water. The water from the NGOs comes from the water trust, a similar model that is being used widely in the US, in the Pacific Northwest. It's a voluntary market, acquiring water rights from farmers and dedicating that for industry flows, right? And so we came with that to the government. It was not asking like, you need to put water back in the river, we don't know how. No, it was like, okay, we have this amount of water, we are willing to provide this for restoration, and it would be great if you can match it, And so the governments, what they did is they started analyzing, and they created their water allocation through water savings, through investment in water infrastructure to save water and then be able to dedicate that. That's the summary. It's more complex than that, and a lot of organizations participating, Natura Noroeste, the Nature Conservancy, Solut Institute, Audubon Society, and Restauremos el Colorado.
That's great. And Edalin, I know you have, with the work that the recovery programs have done, both on the San Juan and the Upper Colorado, have also done investment in infrastructure and dam reoperation and purchasing water. Tell me a little bit about how that has worked and how that has contributed to the recovery of the fish themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you have that slide, that single slide handy, you could pop that up on the screen and we could talk through that a little too. So the recovery programs kind of are built on 7 different pillars of work, and one of those is in-stream flow management, providing flows for the endangered fish. Another is habitat restoration, working to reconnect those historical habitats with passages, creating habitat in floodplains. And then we've got some of that more physical infrastructure that you were talking about too, screening irrigation canals to prevent entrainment, and then non-native fish control. So working with state partners to manage sport fisheries or, removing problem species. But 3 of those 7, so those 3 pillars that I just talked about, all involve water. Water is obviously critical. The fish can't live without it. But so, looking at this map that we have up on the screen, it's showing some of the areas that the recovery program has really worked across the Upper Basin, and some of those interventions that we've been able to take on behalf of the fish, particularly. So some of those ways that we're able to get wet water into the river are through leases. We have also in-stream flow water rights that are held by the state of Colorado for the benefit of these species. We also have, reservoir space that is actually allocated to the recovery programs to provide additional flows. We work with all of the large federal reclamation projects in the Upper Basin to coordinate some of their releases. We also work with a bunch of water providers in the Upper Colorado River that engage in something called coordinated reservoir operations. So that means what they do is in years when there's heavy snowpack, the reservoirs in the Upper Colorado can't store it all under the water rights. They have to let some of it pass. And so what they'll do is they'll hold that water and then coordinate together to do a release that will mimic the natural spring peaks that we used to see before the system got so plumbed. And so the results of that in that 15-mile reach in the Upper Colorado River have just been fantastic. They've been able to do it, I think, 18 out of the past 20 years. So even in years when we've seen or been expecting, lower snowpack or low spring flows, we've had really great response from our partners in those areas to engage in this coordinated release system where, we've been able to really provide some benefits to the species that use that habitat.
That's great. And Nate, so you're working with water, you're not buying water, you're doing habitat restoration, but you've probably had to deal with the water issue also. Is that right?
Absolutely. And I think it really goes back to good relations again with our downstream water users or adjacent landowners. We started very early working with our water attorney with the Upper Gunnison River Water Conservancy District. And his advice was actually very simple. It was reach out to those adjacent neighbors and downstream water right users before you implement some of these treatments. And so we've had to hold, I'll say, field tours, take folks out and literally walk the treated reaches that we want to implement these simple rock structures and and post structures in to show them that we're not going in there, we're not being heavy-handed and using a lot of heavy equipment and trying to really manipulate the water. It's working with the system as it is and trying, again, let the water do the work and really promote the in-ground water storage. I don't think I did a good job of really connecting the dots, but as we increase our water storage in ground, that's providing that greater productivity for the riparian vegetation. Normally we get the response of a greater diversity of flowering plants, which of course attracts more pollinators, so a greater diversity and abundance of insects. And that is the key forage for the Gunnison sage grouse chicks those first couple weeks. So by connecting all those dots, I believe we're having an impact on chick survival, and that'll ultimately affect the recruitment into the population. Going back early on, we worked with 2 private landowners. That kind of reduced some of the hurdles of working on public lands by starting on private lands. And I'll say we were strategic. We worked with one of our local attorneys that owns a decent sized ranch, got his buy-in through the project, and he was very happy with the results that he was seeing just after a year. The other landowner that we worked with is a local rancher, also was the chairman of the Upper Gunnison River Water Conservancy. So once we had their support, I really think it opened up additional doors on private lands. The seed money, I'll say, that came from Colorado Parks and Wildlife, our wetland grant program, was a great investment because that allowed the BLM and Forest Service to see really what this demonstration project looked like, and then they were able to go after different pots of money to continue to do this work in the future. So again, going back to good relations, being strategic, has really just helped this project take off and be well supported on our public lands as well.
That's great. And so you all have spoken, woven through what you've said, the need to listen, to build trust, to do things that are in the interest of the communities that you're working with and the individuals you're working with. And yet, at the same time, so you're all working with, well, certainly, Edalin, the recovery programs are about 4 endangered fish. So you've got the big ESA hammer hanging over. The Gunnison sage grouse, what became a species of concern pretty much immediately when it was identified as its own species, and then it was listed as a threatened species, I think, in 2009. And so that another hammer came along. There's Oswald, I don't know if this quite applies in your context as well, but maybe you can help me understand whether or not these regulatory hammers occur. But so here's the question, though, a couple of questions that I'd love you to speak to. One is, would the people that you're working with even be playing if it weren't for ESA? And if you don't have the regulatory piece in place and you want to enter into a community to work with them, how do you even judge if there's sufficient common ground shared and sufficient values, and to find that sweet spot where the economic and well-being and personal interests of the communities you're working in line up with the interests of the recovery of these species? So it's all about how do you navigating that political divide and the importance of ESA. Can you speak to that a little bit, how you've dealt with those issues in your work?
if I could start us off. That would be a lovely situation. You know, thinking about it with these 4 fish, which have been on the endangered species list for now 30 or 40 years. Even though we're in the situation where we're looking at downlisting 2 of them to think about a future where we don't have the ESA, kind of helping us move this system along and moving these fish to recovery. If we get to that day where they're recovered with self-sustaining populations, it's great to think about this. In a lot of our other work, TNC is in the situation that you're talking about. We're working in areas where there aren't necessarily critical habitats for these fish or for other native species that are facing threats. It all goes back to kind of the same principle that I talked about before. How do you find that common interest? What is the common interest? Even though there are, you know, many reasons that people might be interested in engaging in certain efforts, what are the things that bring us together? Where is the overlap, and how do we build on that? So maybe that's a little bit of a simplistic answer, but that's, you know, what TNC has really found has helped us engage with folks, just going back to those common interests, respecting each other's goal, working for looking for projects that really can benefit both people and nature.
Yeah. So ESA is important in the Colorado River work, but the broader principle is finding that common ground. And
Yeah,
Nate, I'm guessing that's true where you are as well. And I mean, maybe ESA has actually given you more headaches than it has helped. I'm not sure. I'm just speculating. What do you think?
I think the proposed listing, so in 2000, immediately the environmental groups submitted a petition for federal protection of the Gunnison sage grouse. Fish and Wildlife Service decided that protection was not warranted at that time. They reviewed that decision a few years later, felt that it was warranted, but they precluded it, which made the species a candidate. And I think that's when you're thinking of the decision in 2009, John. It was actually November of 2014 when the Fish and Wildlife Service listed the Gunnison sage grouse as a threatened species. And we've been working through the process of developing a recovery plan. That has not been finalized yet, but will be soon. The development of the recovery implementation strategy is in the works right now, which has, of course, the finer details. But I think that kind of carrot over, overlooming us, so to speak, really motivated the local community here in Gunnison. We didn't want the federal government coming in and really telling us what we could do on our public land allotments, what we could do on our private lands possibly. And so it was enough motivation that it did. It really motivated some of the folks that would be affected by a listing decision to get involved early on. And the state was able to work with some of those private landowners to negate some of the threats that we've seen. But over time, as other threats like development, so additional fragmentation of habitat in some of the outlying populations of Gunnison sage grouse, oil, gas development, again, further fragmenting the habitat, and then the spread of cheatgrass, a noxious weed, again, degrading habitat. I think that with the combination of some of the projected impacts of climate change, that's what really drove the listing decision for Gunnison sage grouse. It's not that some of our conservation efforts were inadequate by any means before. We were doing great work, but there's this recognition that some of these threats are literally almost out of our control, like climate change. And on average, our Gunnison sage grouse population has been over 4,000 birds, closer to 4,500. but it's been some really chaotic, extreme weather events the past 3 years, like the drought of 2018, the severe winter of 2017-18, that actually created this icy, dense snowpack that just was very hard for Gunnison sage grouse to make it through the winter. That's what's driven our local decline here locally to that roughly 2,700 birds. So again, the ESA, yes, I believe it's a good motivator. I believe we've developed great collaboration here in Gunnison. It is a good motivator for getting more of the community involved in these outlying populations, for sure. And again, I believe we're doing the right things, but some threats are simply out of our control. So.
Yeah. So a question that keeps coming has come up several times in our Q&A has been about the political side specifically. So you all have spoken to that to some degree, but could you say explicitly, maybe Osval, you can start how we're in a world that feels really polarized. Certainly it appears that way if you read the newspaper or watch the news. And spare me from social media, of course, but with the polarization. But so what recommendations specifically for dealing with people who are on a different side of that political spectrum and come at the world with a really very different value set? How do you manage that, Osval? What would you recommend to us?
Yeah, and I think that's a very important dimension. The first one is conservation biologists or conservation practitioners is not to shy away from it. Take a dive into understanding the politics of the system that you're working on. Typically, we say, no, I'm not interested in politics. I'm interested in nature, but it doesn't work that way, especially at this time. So that would be my first suggestion, is that really understand the political system motivation and the players and their incentives, and then that constituency, the people that support it. And so I think it's linked a little bit with the previous question. I think we need to understand all of the tools that we might have. The legal tools, it might be Endangered Species Act, it may be litigation. Very important to understand what those tools might be, but also when to use them, not just go straight to them, but not that you have them. And then also learn about the incentives, what people care about, why are they saying what they are saying, what are maybe missing information that they don't have that you can help them understand better. And then also in every conservation program, I always say that you need to build the social support system, the support of the community, of the stakeholders, of the public, to different ways. It's not only environmental education, but if we get to the decision makers and help them understand the goals and why, and then also same way around, understand their motivation. I think it's all about that. My sense is that when you don't know each other, the extreme sides, it's very easy to be polarized. When people get together and really know each other, normally the tendency is to be more moderate, and try to be social and be civilized. That's for me, in my experience, has been most of the cases. It's really bringing people together and try to find that balance, and so that people feel that they are considered and that they've been heard out, and of course, they need to see that their input is really taken into account into the decision-making process. For me, that's key, and in the case of the Delta, the ESA is not really that critical because of the international border. So it's been more about the incentives, And we developed this kind of tool that we call citizens diplomacy and integrated negotiation, in which the decision about the basin includes, of course, restoration and water for the environment, but we're also talking about drought and water conservation and how are we going to address shortages, no? And the key part is that to become a facilitator in the, you know, and a genuine broker, you know, in the process that people can trust. So for us, that's been very helpful. You know? And that's something that we want to replicate across Latin America because, yeah, the legal or the litigation process is not like in the US, so we need to find different tools and mechanisms.
The one thing I hear in your answer, I'm guessing that you often need to kind of suspend your own, like, I would like to see this, and you have to set that aside a little bit as you engage with these partners and these communities. Edalin, during my time at TNC, one thing I observed is the power of finding an influencer in the community. So when I first went to work for the Nature Conservancy in the mid-2000s, we had some funding from Colorado Department of Transportation to do a land deal in Southeast Colorado. And we were not welcome in Southeast Colorado. And we ended up through our network finding, doing a deal with an individual who happened to own the feed store, and he was connected to everyone, and he became an ally. Is that something you do as well, where you have certain influencers that you work with, so you find somebody in that otherwise conservative place who you can have a real conversation with, and then that person works within their community?
I'd say across my work at TNC, that's definitely the case. But the recovery programs, I don't think that that's as much of the case. And I say that because I think the partners themselves are those folks. Like I mentioned, some of the partners include water users. And so when the programs are cost-shared programs, which means that the federal government pays some of it, but the rest is made up from the other partners. And so we, the non-federal partners, go to DC every year to support federal appropriations that are used in our program. And often the folks that we have speaking on behalf of the program in those situations are the water users themselves, who, you know, get the benefit of ESA compliance from these projects. And so, you know, sometimes those water users would be the first in line to, you know, speak out against in-stream flows or have concerns about in-stream flows. But in our program, really, those are the folks that are providing the strongest voice of support for the continuation of the programs and for funding for those programs.
That's great. Hey, we are just about out of time. I want to ask, you know, one more question. If you could all three give me a short answer to this, and I'm building a little bit off of Monday's plenary, where let me see. This was the quote. I think this is great. It all comes down to love, compassion, and empathy. That was the moderator on Monday summed up that panel with those words. And those are deeply, deeply personal words and personal issues, right? Love, compassion, and empathy. I wonder if you could all close us out by, in 1 minute, sharing, you know, an example of hard personal work you have had to do as you've entered into this collaborative conservation space. Osfeld?
Sure. Yeah, no, I love that quote. And I will say that we need to be really passionate about what we're trying to achieve in nature conservation. But we really need to believe in people. You know? And we need to be hopeful and be able to share that hope and inspire people to be passionate about conservation of nature. So that's why I love a lot what we're doing right now, trying to build this capacity for these conservation leaders all along Latin America. For me, that's the key element. No, I will add hope to that process.
Thank you. Nate, what about you?
I think it's okay to show folks that you're human. You know, you have to kind of strike that chord and be able, again, to relate with them and, again, show that you care and that you're respectful of their different opinions maybe and their values. But, you know, as long as you can find that shared vision or common ground, that goal, I think it's okay to have different thoughts, values, opinions, and, you know, continue that conversation and work through it. I know some of my ranchers, they really don't want to recognize that their land provides habitat for a threatened species. But when I can come to them and we can cost share on a project, and I can promise them that I'm going to be able to provide more forage for their cattle, you know, it kind of makes it difficult for them to say no. So again, we're coming from different angles, but we're finding that shared vision, and we can find that common ground and work with each other.
And Edalin, how do you show up with your humanity?
Oh gosh, that's a blunt way of asking your question. No, I agree with what, you know, the things that Osel and Nate has said. And on top of that, you know, I think one thing that's been really kind of clear for me is the vulnerability that you have to come into some of these experiences with. The willingness not only to be vulnerable yourself and, you know, talk about those things that mean so much to you, like the conservation of these species, but also to be vulnerable in hearing the opposite side and being a good listener. So yeah, getting to those common goals takes a lot of work.
Yeah. Well, you know, you all have shown up with vulnerability and your full selves here, and you've shared some great technical work and conservation outcomes, but you've also shared a lot about yourselves and how you navigate this challenging work. So your passion and your commitment and your intelligence is deeply appreciated by me, and I know the 150 or so conference attendees who joined us for the last hour and a half. So I thank you so very much. For me personally, it's been a ton of fun getting to know you all a bit more and getting to engage in this conversation. So thank you, and this will close this out.
Thank you, John.
Thanks
Thank
so
you very much,
Bye-bye.
John.